Welcome to the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective. I'm Tony Aguilar. On today's podcast, since its independence from Great Britain in 1948, the nation of Burma, now known as Myanmar, has struggled with military dictatorship. But in 2015, in what seemed to be a positive sign of heading towards becoming a stable democracy, Aung San Suu Kyi, popular dissident, became the de facto leader of the nation. But in 2021, despite an election in which the National League for Democracy was overwhelmingly supported, the military staged a coup and ousted the democratically elected government. And Aung San Suu Kyi has since been sentenced to 33 years in jail. Since then, the economy has tanked, thousands have been arrested, thousands have been killed, and accusations of genocide continue. Can Myanmar become a stable democracy, or is it becoming a failed state? Next. Joining me from Australia is Sean Turnell. Dr. Turnell is a senior fellow in the Southeast Asia program at the Lowy Institute and professor of economics at Macquarie University. He has served as a senior economic analyst at the Reserve Bank of Australia and policy advisor to the IMF and the World Bank. From 2016 to 2021, he served as a senior economic advisor to the democratic government of Aung San Suu Kyi. Following the coup in 2021, Dr. Turnell was imprisoned where he served for over 600 days because of false charges. Dr. Turnell has written for publications such as the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Financial Times, and the Australian, as well as the BBC, Voice of America, CNBC, and Bloomberg. An author of several books, his audio book entitled Unlikely Prisoner will be available in November. Dr. Turnell, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Tony. It's a pleasure.
I want to start off with this. When the coup started, you were in the government. Was it a surprise? Because the reality is a lot of people were scratching their head. The military still had power. They had, by the Constitution, guaranteed number of seats. They controlled several positions. And it doesn't seem like she was making reforms that would reduce the power of the military. So, what was the cause of the 2021 coup?
Well, as you surmised, Tony, it was a total surprise. And for all the reasons you've enunciated, the military, in a sense, were in a very good position. The democratic government was taking a lot of the hits for some of the more controversial things taking place in the country. So one would have thought that they were sitting pretty. So we really get down to the politics of the situation. An election had taken place in November, and that election had been easily won by Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy, or NLD. But the military didn't accept the outcome, in essence. The military has often misjudged public opinion towards them. So, in fact, at previous elections, the immediate preceding election, when Suu Kyi likewise won an election, the military never really accepted the outcome then at that time as well. But then certainly again at 2020, they didn't accept the outcome. They began a campaign across that year of trying to undermine its legitimacy. But I don't think anyone really thought that they would go fully towards a coup. But of course, as you point out, that's exactly what they did on the 1st of February 2021. But so, yeah, in essence, it's a fight over control, a military unwilling to accept a democratic government. Couple of other factors come in, though. So even though that they're largely sitting pretty, there were some factors that I think were coming their way that they started to worry about. One was, I think, they didn't trust that the democratic government wouldn't hand over senior military officials to the International Criminal Court because of some things going on in Rakhine State, some terrible atrocities being committed by the military in Rakhine State. So I think the military started to get nervous about that. The second thing is that even though the economic reforms under Suu Kyi were not overtly directed against the military, because they were about increasing competition, opening up the economy, etc., it was beginning to intrude on military interests. So Myanmar's military have often had fairly high degrees of control over Myanmar's economy, and that was starting to be eroded. So they're unhappy about that as well. So I think we have to think of those two factors going on in the background as well then. The fear of the military that they might end up in The Hague, and secondly, that their economic position was being undermined through the liberal reforms being undertaken by the government.
There has been sort of a shadow government created, the National Unity Government, which has been recognized by the European Parliament and I believe the French Senate. And there's been calls to recognize that particular opposition. Um, what has been happening with that? Because they have been a steady opposition, they're still fighting to regain power. What is happening according to your understanding right now?
The NUG, the National Unity Government, I think has been much more successful than people originally thought. One of the most remarkable things has been the degree of unity. So this NUG, it's not only former members of the National League for Democracy and people who were elected in 2020. Critically, it also includes many key ethnic groups in Myanmar. So it's a much more inclusive organisation, in fact, than just about any other that's ever come about. So that's been part of the reason for its success, I think, is the degree of unanimity, both within Myanmar and amongst diaspora communities outside. The second thing, of course, is that militarily, the People's Defence Forces, or PDF, which is aligned with that National Unity Government, have been much more successful in their struggle militarily against the junta ruling Myanmar. So we've got those two things, I think, very much a unified government in the government or alternative government in the form of the NUG, and then that success on the battlefield, which but both of those things I think are somewhat unexpected.
Now, one of the issues that is obviously a worldwide issue is the treatment of the Rohingya, the Muslim minority, both by the military, but also by, I'll say, Suu Kyi, who did not really speak up in terms of genocide. Um, how do people really feel about that? I know that internally it may be different, but around the world it's being deemed as genocide.
Yeah, indeed, and it was the great tragedy of the period of democratic government from 2016 to 2021. There's no question about that. I think we have to be clear about it, though, in assigning the blame where it's due, and that is that this genocide was being committed by the military. Now, Suu Kyi, because I was part of advising her and so on, I got to see a lot of the things that she was trying to do that frankly were not in the public sphere at that time. And she was trying a number of strategies to try and pull them back. One of the things that I was involved in, for instance, is that we were trying to devise a system where we could employ international sanctions and other things to try and target some of the military people that were involved in those operations. We were trying some other things in terms of trying to remove resources from the military units involved in all of that. So there were things going on in the background which weren't, as I say, part of the public sphere. But having said that, there was no doubt that the democratic government never got the message right over this particular issue. Again, individuals within that government were horrified by what was taking place for the Rohingya, but they never really got into a position of being able to effectively oppose the military there. There was a great fear, which of course has been proven correct, given the coup on 1st of February 2021, that the military wouldn't accept any pushback anyway, and that they would act against a democratic government that was trying to move against the military. But it was very fraught. And just to acknowledge too that definitely mistakes were made. There's no question. I think the democratic government made mistakes in how it went about trying to ameliorate the situation, trying to stop some of the violence being committed by the military. Yeah, definitely mistakes were made. My assessment of the people involved within the democratic government was that those mistakes were what you would say were um, were sincere in a sense that they were genuinely trying to stop the violence, and as I say, were horrified that it was taking place, and likewise, senior members of that government, including Suu Kyi, did not have, in my view, any sort of prejudices against the Rohingya or anyone else. But which is not to deny that I think mistakes were made in that period.
You think she ultimately would have said, let's find a way to get citizenship for the Rohingya?
Yes, I think so. And one of the things we're working on that is innovative ways of a national ID system, for instance, of the sort that has been rolled out in India under the so-called Aadhaar system. So we were looking for technological fixes as well to get around some of these problems, just sort of innovative ways through which we could sort of just get around some of these terrible old prejudices that are there in the country, because of course that's one of the underlying things that's taking place throughout all of this, and that is that Myanmar, Burma, is a very divided country, ethnically, religiously, and so on. So that these undercurrents are there, and of course they require very deft handling, uh, and so they're difficult for a perfect government. The democratic government wasn't that, and of course this military regime is certainly not that.
Let's go back a little bit and talk about how you got involved with Madam Che's government. How did that happen?
Oh, it goes a long way back, mate. It goes back to the mid 1990s, where I had met some Burmese people at university, started helping them to do certain things. And because I was an economist at the Reserve Bank in Australia, Australia's central bank, I started helping out some of the people in exile, critique some of the economic policies of the military regime that was then in place, because of course military regimes have been in place throughout most of Myanmar's period since independence. So I would help people analyse some policies, come up with new policies for that day, if freedom and democracy were ever to come to Myanmar. So through that, I got to know senior people within the National League for Democracy, including Aung San Suu Kyi. I wrote a history of Myanmar's monetary history, in essence, of Myanmar. She read that, quite liked it, got in contact with me, asked me could I help them, which I did. And then, of course, after the big election victory in November 2015, she took up office and she asked me would I come over and help them out in the reform effort. So I made my way there in 2016 and stayed there all the way up until the coup of 2021.
Part of your work was to create some economic policies that would lift up the country. And in fact, that did start to happen and sanctions started to be lifted. I know President Obama did visit the country and they started to see a difference. But then you, along with the Democratic government, which was ousted, you were arrested. How did that make you feel? Because it's not, they knew who you were.
Yep.
And I have to assume that you knew who some of the military leaders were as well. But how did that make you feel when you were arrested as essentially, betraying the government, which was some of their charges?
Yeah. Well, firstly, it made me feel very frightened. Was the first emotion, of course. But I had as soon as the coup took place, I was obviously became worried because, as you've identified, I knew many of the actors. I knew where our policies were going. I knew that what was being created was a much more competitive economy. And so the monopolies, etc., that the military had in place, some of those were being eroded. So I knew that they were very angry towards us. I knew also that part of their campaign was to show that the economic reforms were somehow directed by foreigners and that foreigners were in control and were going to be undermining Myanmar's sovereignty. So I knew in that context that someone like me was going to be a particular target. So I guess, yeah, I suppose worry and anxiety was the first response because I knew that I would be targeted.
Now, since then, you were pardoned by the military. You received a pardon, which they have since pulled back and has made you into somewhat of a what they would call an international criminal, filing your name with Interpol, saying that you can't come back. But the National Unity Government has again approached you to be an economic advisor. Now, one has to assume that does not mean that you're going to be going back to Myanmar anytime soon or any place like that. But let me ask you this: if the National Unity Government were to take over, would you go back to Myanmar?
I probably wouldn't, Tony. No, I'm very happy to assist them, and I maintain a very great love for the country. Because notwithstanding, I was in prison there for nearly 2 years. It was, of course, Myanmar people who kept me alive, and I was the recipient of incredible kindness from people who were extraordinarily courageous. Because the implications of them for helping me were just simply dire. So, some of the most wonderful human beings I've ever encountered are people from Myanmar. So, yeah, I have nothing but goodwill for the country. I think in the future, though, the time for people like me is probably over. I think one of the things we were able to do in that democratic period from 2016 to 2021 was to train up a cohort of incredible young Burmese economists and administrators and officials and the business community was really developing as well. So in other words, I think there's a cohort of incredibly capable young people from Myanmar and older as well, who should be and can be very much at the forefront. And I think actually their capabilities are on display now via things like this national unity government and other things. So so I think the role of someone like myself, who was useful in those very early days, because Myanmar had been locked away from the international community and international thinking for 50 years. So at that point, there was a bit of a role for well disposed foreigners like myself to help out in various ways and open doors and bring some ideas in and so on. But I think in the future, I have great faith, again, in particularly amongst the young people of Myanmar to take it forward. And I think, someone like me can help out a little bit at the edges, but we're pretty much obsolete.
Let me ask you this. When you speak of the future and quite optimistically, but when you look at the alignment right now of Myanmar, they're supported by China, and they are supported by Russia, who is providing weaponry, particularly for the air, so they can attack the various communities of Myanmar. Do you think it is really feasible to think that there's going to be some democratic type of government anytime soon, given those two countries which are on their side in the United States, which is taking sort of a hands-off approach? I mean, they have had sanctions on the country, but they're not really getting that much involved. So, I mean, how realistic do you think it is that Myanmar may become a democratic nation once again anytime soon?
I'm still optimistic, Tony, and the main reason for that optimism is that the people want it. The people of Myanmar absolutely want democracy, and they're fighting and putting their lives on the line for it. Even as we speak. And the reason why the junta are on the back foot is because of that passion for freedom and justice that people are struggling for now. So, on the basis of that, and given the sacrifices and so on, I do think that an outcome in the form of a democratic Myanmar is still definitely there. Now, but you're right to point out that that's not going to be made easier by the support of countries like Russia and China to the junta. And again, correctly, as you pointed out, one of the real evil things that's taking place in Myanmar at the moment is that even though the junta are very much losing the battles on the ground, of course they have command over the air, and in that way, in that place, they are getting significant support again, particularly from Russia. So it's of great concern. Beyond those two countries, which I think China and Russia playing a almost completely negative role, other countries have been somewhat supportive to the NUG, but as you identified, not to the extent that they've been supportive for Ukraine, for instance. And I think that distinction is quite notable. On the other hand, I think there's a huge goodwill towards the NUG and to freedom in Myanmar more broadly. And at the forefront of that is the US. So even though, for many people concerned about Myanmar, it's not enough, but nonetheless, the US has probably done more than anyone else. So just to, put that on the table first, I think there needs to be much more significant support from other countries, including my own country here in Australia, but likewise in Asia as well. But yeah, I still remain optimistic that democracy might come to Myanmar. And again, it really centres on that idea that throughout all of this, the people's desire for democracy just seems to be unwavering.
There was some criticism of Australia having some connection with the military junta, and what the Australian government had said was maybe training exercises and the like. Where is Australia right now in its relationship with Myanmar?
So I think for Australia, Tony, the biggest problem is that Myanmar seems a long way away and very distant. And Australia has what it would regard as much more significant relationships in Asia that it likes to focus on. So I think that that's part of the problem, that it's not that I think, well, certainly I know Australia doesn't support the military in any way, but I think the problem here is that people probably don't care enough about the situation there. It's not on the nightly news here. It's not in people's face in any way. In fact, again, in Australia, much less, for instance, than Ukraine. But if we're talking about distances, of course, Ukraine is much further distance from Australia than Myanmar is. So I think in part it's just a lack of attention, to be honest. Myanmar, because it has been poor and underperforming economically for so long, it's not an important marketplace. It's not an important place to supply the region or countries like Australia with energy or anything like that. So it just doesn't figure, I think, on the radar screen of most people. And so I think that's more the problem, that is really indifference more than anything else. So then I think, the onus then to change that comes on to people like myself and to people like the diaspora, the Burmese diaspora around the region. And of course, many of them have been extraordinarily energetic. So I'm hopeful for some change on that front as well.
Which brings me to the question when you talk about people who have a vested interest in Myanmar. Let's go back to China for a minute, because China sees Myanmar as a place where it can get its goods, ship its goods through the Indian Ocean. So it is very strategic for them from a trade perspective. Whereas, as you just said, with Australia, United States, and most countries of the West, there's not really that much of an interest in there from an economic perspective. So the question would be, how would you bridge that gap with a country like the United States, obviously parts of the European Union, so that it's a win-win situation for everyone, because the military is not simply going to go away.
Yeah, no, absolutely right, Tony. And you're right to point out just how important Myanmar is to China. I'm sure you know, and listeners would know that much of China's trade goes through the Straits of Malacca. And likewise, deliveries of oil come on ships through the Straits of Malacca. So it's a bit of a choke point, if you like, for China. Now, Myanmar, however, offers an alternative avenue to get goods in and out of China. Ships, instead of going down the Straits of Malacca, could simply call into a port. There's a big port there called Jiaopu, and then be taken by rail and pipeline and so on up through Myanmar and up into China's Yunnan province. So Myanmar is strategically very important because, in a sense, it is a land bridge that's an alternative to the Straits of Malacca. So it's strategically very important. Likewise, for China, Myanmar is a marketplace. A lot of the lower cost goods provided by China can find a ready market in Myanmar. And then finally, Myanmar is a supply of some critical raw materials to China. So, for instance, rare earths are quite prevalent in Myanmar, and China, of course, is always anxious to secure those supply lines, but likewise oil and gas and so on as well. So Myanmar is very important to China. So given all of that, I think that's exactly the sort of thing that needs to be on the mind of countries like the United States, countries in Europe, countries like Australia as well, is to recognise that Myanmar has a significant place in the great global game, if you like, strategically and economically, and for that reason then requires attention. And I think, it's in the interests of the West, of Europe, but also much of the rest of the world as well, for Myanmar to be a safe and peaceful and stable place. And that might mean that, again, that, we just have to pay the country a little bit more attention than might otherwise be the case. Myanmar's an important location.
One of the other criticisms has been the lack of a strong response from the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. The U.S. wants them to have a firmer stance towards that. What is preventing them from taking, particularly places like Malaysia, from taking a stronger stance towards what's happening in Myanmar?
Yeah, it's been very frustrating, and I think frustrating for ASEAN itself, because in a sense, I think the whole issue of how to deal with Myanmar and the way in which Myanmar's junta has just repelled any effort by ASEAN uh, puts the credibility of ASEAN at significant risk. I guess at the heart of this, we've got the issue that is very central for ASEAN of non-interference in each other's internal affairs, and of course that suits a great many countries in ASEAN, not simply Myanmar. I think the difference here, though, is that the issues in Myanmar are so egregious. We're not talking about, if I could say, run-of-the-mill human rights abuses, but a situation where that's transcended. We openly talk about issues of genocide and so on. So, I think the issues in Myanmar are different orders of magnitude to most other places in Asia. So that does present ASEAN with a real challenge. And I think there are many individual members of ASEAN that have actually done quite a number of good things, but I think there's a real issue of coordination that's a problem. Indonesia has been very strong, for instance. I think Vietnam's been very strong. Malaysia, yeah, it's a bit strange to look at that country because it has voiced concerns many times in the past over what's been happening to the Rohingya, for example. But yeah, I think for Malaysia and for many of the other countries in ASEAN, there's been an inability to come up with a proper coordinated response.
Let me, going back to the beginning, when you think about one of the initial movements, the Saffron movement, for example, which did push the military towards becoming less militaristic and maybe going towards democracy. Do you think the national unity government has the same potential of making the military stand down the way the Saffron movement did? I mean, that was led by pretty much Buddhist monks, but do they have the same power, the same momentum to do so?
I think they do, and I think that's why we see the conflict so widespread across the country, in that people are actively resisting the military. I think in ways that are even more pronounced, actually, than back in 2007. So I think that the strength of feeling is actually more heartfelt, if you like, than it was then. I think the difference is this time is the response of the military. Um, I mentioned, different orders of magnitude a moment ago, and I would use the same expression with respect to the junta now compared to past military regimes in Myanmar, which is just to say that this current junta is much more desperate, is much more ruthless, much more willing to kill to stay in control. Whereas I think if we go back to 2007, of course, the military was willing to kill people then as well, but I suspect not to the extent, not to the full measure that the current regime seems to be happy to dish out.
Now, one of the things that no matter what happens, Myanmar is going to have to deal with is its ethnic issues. You're talking about over 100 different ethnicities. So, how do you think they're going to deal with that? Because it is a country, because we tend to think of Buddhist monks, for example, as very peaceful. But we also know that there is tremendous animosity between the Buddhist monks and the Rohingya community. How is that going to be resolved?
Well, I guess it needs to be resolved. And firstly, I agree with the premise here, which is that it does need to be resolved. On the upside, I think there is an understanding of that. I mentioned earlier this NUG is not just the old National League for Democracy, but it is very much a coalition of the sort of democracy forces, plus various of the ethnic groups as well. So I think the first thing is important to note is that there is a thorough recognition that until it gets this issue right of how to bring all the groups in Myanmar together, then there's not going to be a long-term solution. There won't be long-term peace. So that's the first thing. I think the recognition of that. And if you look at various policies and pronouncements of the NUG, you'll see that coming through again and again and again. It's very often the first item that's mentioned when any particular policy is announced. So I think that's the first thing. And likewise, I think, I've been harping on the degree of brutality that gets meted out by this current junta. Now, that's had one positive effect in a sense, and that is it has united everyone else. So, in a sense, that message can be made by the NUG, but in another negative way, it's also being made by the junta itself.
Can Aung San Suu Kyi be the leader again of the country? Now, the Constitution, as it now stands, doesn't allow her to be president, but she was the de facto leader of the country anyway. But given that her star has decreased somewhat in the international community, and some want even to have the Nobel Peace Prize from 1991 revoked, can she regain her stature in order to lead the nation again should NUG be successful in its attempt to oust the military from the government?
Well, I think she can. Her status within the country, of course, is still enormously high. And I would say, frankly, undiminished. And I think this latest incarceration has only added, in a sense, to her reputation within the country in that way. In some ways, being imprisoned again just sort of brings forth some of her strengths, etc. However, and I think on this, she would be the very first to say that in the longer term, of course, it has to be taken up by other people. Um, like us all, she's not getting any younger. She's 77 now. If things were to change soon, one could certainly imagine her playing a very strong and very central role. But clearly, in the medium to longer term, that is not going to happen. But I could certainly envisage her emerging as a unifying figure within the country to bring groups together and so on. But again, perhaps use this opportunity just to reiterate what I mentioned a little while ago too, which is just to say that there has been an emergence of young, capable Myanmar people who I think will take the torch forward. So so I guess in summary, I think she can and would be willing to play a strong and central role, but I can see other people coming to the fore quite quickly as well.
Now, you are someone that people do speak to. They seek your advice on economic matters, and they would seek your advice on nations such as Myanmar. If you were talking to the Biden administration, what would you tell either Secretary Blinken or the president? What would your advice to them be about how to handle Myanmar?
I think it would be to expand and intensify what they're doing now. So I think the United States has been very supportive of the democracy movement in Myanmar in all sorts of ways, whether it be from helping refugees to providing non-lethal support to the opposition movement as well. I think a critical thing the United States can do, and again they're doing some of this already, but just going the extra measure would be to start to choke off the resources, but particularly the financial resources that the junta can get its hands on. So I guess here I'm talking sanctions, but in particular financial sanctions. So recently, the United States sanctioned two of the key banks that belong to the junta, and that has been highly successful in Myanmar in terms of limiting the just the physical capabilities or the financial capabilities rather of the junta in sourcing weaponry, etc. So enhancing that, there are a few more banks that could come under similar sanctioning. Doing more of that, just denying the financial resources that the junta needs to conduct its war against the people. I think that's the sort of thing the United States can do. As I said, it is doing it, but it can do some more as well.
In the few minutes we have left, where do you see Myanmar, let's say in the next 4 to 5 years, keeping in mind that if the U.S. is going to play a central role in what happens there, that there is an election coming up in 2024, as you well know, and depending upon who occupies the White House will determine what the policy is going to be, obviously. But where do you think Myanmar will be in the next several years?
I think it could go any number of ways, Tony. My hope and still my expectation, hasten to add, is that it could be once again reconstructing itself, reconfiguring itself for peace and democracy. The regime is incredibly brutal, as we've mentioned. In many ways, it appears very strong. I actually think, though, that it's extraordinarily brittle. I also think it's not unified. It's the sort of regime I think that it would not be fanciful to wake up one morning to find that parts of the military junta have turned on each other, for instance. There's a lot of elite business people, people connected to the military, who have lost hundreds of millions of dollars because of this coup and the way in which Myanmar once again has been separated from the international community. So there are a lot of people who have lost a lot, obviously everyday people in terms of their lives and so on, but a lot of very powerful people have frankly just lost a lot of money because of this regime. And one gets hints all the time of unhappiness within that elite and within the junta itself. So I really can envisage a scenario in which the junta itself just suddenly collapses. Um, and it has, negligible support amongst the people. So it's not like there would be any sort of groundswell of support to sort of prop them back up. So that to me is probably the most likely scenario. Some internal coup, internal collapse within the junta, then quickly leading to a much better outcome. More pessimistically, of course, you could envisage a situation where the current terrible situation in the country just keeps going on. That, in other words, you have a stalemate, you have a powerful military, as brittle as it might be, but nonetheless getting the support of Russia and China and just having enough wherewithal just to keep on going, keep on committing atrocities against, unwavering resistance, but where that just drags on year after year after year. That's sort of the worst case scenario, I suppose. Um, and then I suppose you could have a middle way where perhaps again some sort of split within the current regime, but a better regime coming in its place that may not be democratic and so on. Some sort of compromise type thing, if you like. That would have been likely before. I'm not sure that third outcome, which in some ways sounds as if it would be a likely one, I'm not sure now, because again, the atrocities committed by the ruling junta now are so extreme, the anger towards them so profound, that it's just hard to imagine anything like that coming. People in Myanmar these days often talk about that, it's not just a fight for democracy anymore. They call it a revolution of the mind, a revolution of the way that things are done in the country. I think, again, for many young people, they want a different sort of system. They don't want a democracy within which, say, still military-dominated companies command control of the economy, etc. They really want something profoundly different. So that third possibility of a sort of compromise is probably, I think, the least likely. And so, I do hope and expect, and I hope my expectation is not driven by my hope, that some sort of internal collapse with the junta and the emergence of a democratic Myanmar is still on the cards.
Turnell from the Lowy Institute has been my guest today has been Dr. Sean Turnell of the Lowy Institute, and I want to thank him for his great insights on the conflict in Myanmar. Dr. Turnell, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Tony.
And thank you for joining us today, and join us again next week as we feature another issue of global importance and interest here on the Aguilar Conversations, A Global Perspective.
The Aguilar Conversations, A Global Perspective, is produced by Casa Margo Communications Group.